medieval people believed the world was full of spirits. Some were good, like angels and the souls of saints. Many were not. These were demons, and they were everywhere. They hid in dark forests, at lonely crossroads, and even in your own home. They could sour your milk, sicken your child, or whisper sinful thoughts into your mind as you tried to sleep. This belief wasn't new. It grew from old roots that reached deep into the past. The main source was the Bible. But the Old Testament's view of evil was different from what came later. The figure of Satan wasn't yet the king of hell. In the book of Job, he's more like a prosecuting attorney in God's court. He works for God, testing the faith of humans. He's an adversary, not a rebel leader. Other dark spirits existed, like the desert demon Azazel, but there was no organized kingdom of evil. The serpent in the Garden of Eden was just a serpent, a cunning beast. Later thinkers would say it was Satan in disguise, but the original text doesn't. Everything changed with the New Testament. Here, the devil is a real and personal enemy. He is the tempter of Christ in the wilderness, offering him all the kingdoms of the world. Jesus spends much of his time casting demons out of people. These weren't just metaphors for mental illness. To the people of the time, and to medieval Christians who read these stories, they were literal possessions. The Gospels present a world where a spiritual war is happening. God and his angels are on one side. Satan and his demons are on the other, and humanity is the battlefield. The book of Revelation sealed this idea. It described a great war in heaven where the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, is cast down to earth with his angels. They lost the war in heaven, so now they fight it on earth. Other stories, not found in the official Bible, also shaped these beliefs. Jewish folklore and apocryphal texts were very popular. The Book of Enoch, for instance, tells a detailed story about fallen angels. It says these angels came to earth, lusted after human women, and had children with them. These children were giants who filled the world with violence. The fallen angels also taught humans forbidden knowledge, like how to make weapons and cosmetics. This story provided a clear origin for demons. They were angels who had chosen to rebel against God out of pride and lust. This idea of a fall from grace became central to Christian demonology. It explained why demons were so intelligent, yet so hateful of God and his creation. The world before Christianity also had its own spirits. The Greeks and Romans believed in beings called daemons. These weren't all evil. A daimon could be a guardian spirit, a source of inspiration, or just a minor local god of a river or a mountain. Socrates claimed to have a daimon that guided him. When Christianity spread, it couldn't just ignore these beliefs. They were too ingrained in the culture. So the church did something clever. It didn't deny their existence. Instead, it reclassified them. All of these pagan spirits, from the great gods of Olympus to the smallest nymph in a stream, were demoted. They were all declared to be demons in disguise, tricking humanity into false worship. This turned the entire spiritual landscape of the old world into a demonic minefield. Early Christian thinkers, known as the Church Fathers, took all these threads and wove them together. Saint Augustine was one of the most important. He wrote in the 4th and 5th centuries, a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing. He needs to explain why there's so much suffering in a world created by a good God. Demons were a big part of the answer. Augustine argued that demons were indeed fallen angels. They were powerful, but not all-powerful. They were spirit, not flesh, but they could manipulate the physical world. They could stir up winds to create storms or create illusions to trick the senses. But Augustine was clear on one point: demons could not create anything. Only God could create. Demons could only manipulate, corrupt, and destroy what God had already made. And most importantly, they could not force a human to sin. They could tempt, suggest, and persuade, but the final choice always belonged to the individual. This idea of free will was crucial. It meant that humans were not just helpless puppets. They were active participants in the spiritual war. These foundational ideas from the Bible, from folklore, from paganism, and from early theologians' point, created the world that the medieval person inhabited. It was a world where the devil was real, his minions were everywhere, and the struggle for your soul was a daily reality. For centuries, belief in demons was a messy collection of folk tales, biblical stories, and local superstitions. A peasant in France might have a different idea of a demon's powers than a farmer in England. But during the High Middle Ages, starting around the 11th century, something began to change. This was the age of scholasticism. Thinkers in the new universities, like those in Paris and Bologna, believed that logic and reason could be used to better understand God and his creation. And if you could use logic to understand heaven, you could also use it to understand hell. Demonology became an academic subject. The goal was to create a system. These scholars were obsessed with order and hierarchy. They looked at the world and saw a great chain of being, with God at the top, then angels, then humans, then animals, and so on. They figured hell must be organized in a similar way. It couldn't just be a chaotic mob of evil spirits. It must have structure. It must be a kingdom, a dark reflection of the kingdom of heaven. So they began to classify demons, to debate their nature, and to define the precise limits of their power. The most influential of these thinkers was Thomas Aquinas. In the 13th century, he wrote the Summa Theologica, a massive work that tried to summarize all of Christian theology. A part of it was dedicated to the nature of angels and, by extension, fallen angels. As Aquinas, using logic and scripture, laid out what became the standard intellectual view of demons for centuries. He argued that demons, being former angels, were pure spirit. They had no physical bodies of their own. This raised a question: how could a bodiless being affect the physical world? Aquinas explained that they could manipulate matter that already existed. They could move the air to create sounds or storms. They could take on temporary bodies made of compressed air, appearing as humans or animals to deceive people. But these bodies were not real. They were like puppets. Aquinas also confirmed that demons were incredibly intelligent. They had not lost their angelic intellect when they fell. They had vast knowledge of the natural world and of human nature. This is what made them such effective tempters. They knew your specific weaknesses, your secret desires, your hidden fears. They could use this knowledge to craft the perfect temptation just for you. But Aquinas also stressed the limits of their power, echoing Augustine. A demon could not read your thoughts directly, because the mind was a sacred space open only to God. They could only guess at your thoughts by observing your actions and your physical reactions. And they absolutely could not force you to sin. The final decision always rested with your own free will. This was a critical point. It preserved human responsibility. You couldn't just say, "the devil made me do it." While Aquinas provided the philosophical framework, other writers got more specific, creating detailed catalogs of hell's inhabitants. They gave demons names, titles, and specific jobs. Drawing on various sources, including obscure magical texts, they constructed elaborate infernal hierarchies. There were kings, princes, dukes, and marquises of hell. There were legions of demonic soldiers under their command. Beelzebub was a prince, Asmodeus was a king who specialized in lust, and Belial was a demon of lies. Each had a specific number of legions serving them. This effort to map hell was a way of containing it, of making the terrifying chaos of evil seem manageable and understandable. If you could name your enemy and know his rank, you had a kind of power over him. These classifications became more and more detailed over time. One text might list 72 principal demons, while another might list hundreds. They were described in vivid detail. A demon might appear as a man with the head of a griffin, or a toad riding a wolf. These catalogs were like a field guide to the infernal. They told you what a demon looked like, what its powers were, and sometimes even what words you had to use to command it. Of course, this veered dangerously close to magic, which the church condemned, but the desire to know and to organize was powerful. This intellectual project had a huge impact. It took the vague fears of ordinary people and gave them a solid theological structure. The parish priest could now explain to his congregation not just that demons existed, but exactly what they were, what they could do, and what they could not do. It transformed demons from spooky monsters in the woods into specific, named enemies in a cosmic war. It provided a language and a system for understanding evil, and by defining the rules of the conflict, it also laid the groundwork for how the church would eventually decide to fight back. Hell was no longer just a terrifying concept. It was an organized enemy state, and the scholars of the church were its intelligence analysts. While scholars in universities debated the finer points of demonic nature, the average person lived with a much more immediate reality. For them, demons were not abstract concepts. They were a part of daily life, an explanation for the constant hardship and uncertainty of the medieval world. Life was fragile. A sudden illness, a lightning strike, a stillborn child, these were not random events. They were often seen as the work of a malicious, unseen world. A demon could be behind any misfortune. When a cow suddenly stopped giving milk, the farmer's wife might suspect a demon had cursed it. When a hailstorm flattened the crops right before harvest, it was easy to believe that demons had summoned the storm out of spite. Sickness was a major area of demonic activity. A person suffering from seizures might be seen as possessed. A deep melancholy or depression could be interpreted as the work of the demon of acedia, which whispered thoughts of despair. Demons were a convenient explanation for things that were otherwise inexplicable and terrifying. They gave a face to suffering. Temptation was the most common and personal interaction with the demonic. Demons were thought to be experts in human weakness. They preyed on the 7 deadly sins. The incubus and succubus were demons who visited people at night, taking the form of a man or a woman to tempt them into lustful thoughts or acts. Other demons might whisper suggestions of greed to a merchant or pride to a knight. This wasn't a forceful attack, it was a subtle process. A demon might plant a single sinful thought in your mind and then step back to watch it grow. The battle against temptation was an internal one, fought in the silence of one's own heart and mind. His confession was the key weapon here. By speaking the sin aloud to a priest, you exposed the demon's work to the light and received God's grace to fight back. Certain places were considered more dangerous than others, more open to demonic influence. Crossroads were notoriously suspect. They were places of transition, belonging to no one, where the veil between worlds was thin. Ancient ruins, burial mounds, and deep, dark forests were also places to be avoided, especially at night. These were the domains of spirits, and a wise person hurried past them, perhaps saying a quick prayer for protection. In time matter too, noon was sometimes considered a dangerous hour, the noonday demon being a special threat. But the true time of danger was the night. Darkness was the demon's cloak. It was when they were strongest and humanity was most vulnerable. But people were not helpless. They had an entire arsenal of spiritual weapons to protect themselves, their families, and their livestock. The official methods were those provided by the church. Holy water was a powerful repellent. A priest would bless it, and people would sprinkle it in their homes, on their fields, and on their animals. The sign of the cross was a simple but potent shield. The sound of church bells was believed to drive demons away, which is why they were rung during storms. In prayer, especially to the Virgin Mary or a patron saint, was a direct appeal for divine help. Relics of saints, a splinter of bone, a piece of cloth that were thought to carry the saint's protective power and were worn as amulets or kept in the home. Alongside these official church protections, a rich world of folk magic existed. The line between religion and magic was often very blurry. A person might wear a blessed medal of a saint right next to an amulet made from a particular herb or stone. Certain plants, like St. John's wort or rowan, were thought to have power against evil spirits. People would hang them over their doors, they might carve symbols on their barns, or recite traditional charms that had been passed down for generations. A priest might see these practices as superstitious, but for the average person it was all part of the same effort to keep evil at bay. You used whatever worked. Life was a constant negotiation with this spiritual world. People tried to stay in a state of grace through the sacraments of the church, but they also respected the old ways and the power of the unseen. They knew that a moment of weakness, a careless word, or a trip to the wrong part of the woods could invite trouble. The world was charged with spiritual significance. Every strange noise in the night, every sudden stroke of bad luck, could be a sign that the enemy was near. This constant awareness shaped the medieval mindset, creating a world where the spiritual and the physical were completely intertwined. For most of the Middle Ages, demons were seen as external enemies. They were like pests or predators. They could tempt you, trick you, and cause you harm from the outside. But in the later medieval period, a new and far more terrifying idea took hold. This was the idea that a human being could willingly choose to become an ally of the devil. They could form a partnership with a demon, becoming a traitor to God and humanity. This was the birth of the concept of the witch as a devil worshipper. The core of this new fear was the diabolical pact. This was a formal agreement, a contract made between a human and a demon. The person would renounce God, reject their baptism, and pledge their allegiance to Satan. In return, the devil would grant them certain powers or rewards. This might be wealth, knowledge, the love of a specific person, or the ability to harm their enemies. This was seen as the ultimate act of heresy and betrayal. It wasn't just about a person sinning out of weakness. It was about a person consciously and deliberately choosing evil over good. This idea changed everything. A demon acting on its own was one thing. A demon working through a human agent, a neighbor who looked just like you, was something else entirely. It created an internal threat, a fifth column in the heart of the Christian community. The witch was no longer just a village-wise woman who knew about herbs or practiced folk magic. She, and it was increasingly seen as a she, was now a soldier in Satan's army. Theologians and inquisitors began to develop a detailed mythology around these diabolical conspiracies. They claimed that witches did not act alone. They gathered in secret groups for meetings called Sabbaths. These were described as grotesque parodies of Christian worship. Instead of gathering in a church, they met at night in a desolate place, like a mountaintop or a clearing in the woods. They were said to travel there by flying, often on broomsticks or on the backs of demons disguised as animals. At the Sabbath, every aspect of Christian life was inverted. Witches were said to desecrate the cross, trample on the Eucharist, and recite prayers backwards. They would kiss the devil, who appeared in the form of a goat or a black man, on his backside as a sign of fealty. The ceremony would supposedly culminate in a wild, promiscuous orgy and a feast that included the flesh of unbaptized infants. These were not eyewitness accounts. They were fantasies constructed from confessions, often extracted under torture and pieced together by inquisitors who already knew what they were looking for. The Sabbath represented everything that good Christian society feared: heresy, sexual deviance, rebellion, and a complete breakdown of social and moral order. Why did this dramatic shift happen? The late Middle Ages was a time of immense anxiety and crisis. The Black Death had killed a huge portion of the population. The 100 Years' War caused widespread devastation. The Church itself was in crisis, with competing popes claiming authority. In times of such profound disruption, people look for explanations and scapegoats. The idea of a vast conspiracy of devil-worshipping witches provided a simple answer to a complex set of problems. It wasn't just bad luck or social decay that was causing all this suffering. It was a deliberate, organized attack by the forces of evil and their human allies. This new understanding of witchcraft as an organized, diabolical religion gave the authorities a reason to act. It transformed what might have been considered minor magical offenses into the crime of high treason against God. It wasn't just about a woman using a charm to heal a cow anymore. It was about a secret society dedicated to the overthrow of Christendom. This belief in the human connection to the demonic world created a climate of intense fear and suspicion. Your neighbor could be an enemy agent. The old woman down the lane could be meeting with the devil. It turned communities against themselves and laid the ideological foundation for the great witch hunts that would sweep across Europe in the centuries to come. The demon was no longer just outside the walls. He had been invited inside. Once the belief in an organized conspiracy of witches took hold, the institutions of power had to respond. The fight against the devil became a formal, legal, and often brutal process. The church and secular authorities developed specific tools and procedures to identify, prosecute, and eliminate those they saw as Satan's human allies. This was not just a spiritual battle fought with prayer. It was a war fought in courtrooms and torture chambers. The oldest weapon was exorcism. This was the official rite of the church for driving a demon out of a possessed person. It was not a wild, frantic affair. It was a solemn and legalistic ritual. The exorcist, a priest given special authority by a bishop, acted as a representative of God's court. He would confront the demon using holy water, a crucifix, and relics. The core of the ritual was the command spoken in the name of Jesus Christ for the demon to depart. The priest would demand the demon's name, its rank, and its reason for possessing the person. It was an interrogation and a spiritual eviction notice. Exorcism reinforced the idea that the church had direct authority over the forces of hell. It was a public demonstration of God's power over the devil. For those who were not possessed but had willingly joined the devil, a different tool was used: the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a system of ecclesiastical courts originally established in the 13th century to combat heresy, particularly movements like the Cathars in southern France. It had a well-developed system for investigation and interrogation. As the definition of witchcraft shifted from simple magic to diabolical heresy, it naturally fell under the Inquisition's jurisdiction. Inquisitors were often highly educated men, usually Dominicans or Franciscans, who saw themselves as doctors of the soul, rooting out the cancer of heresy to save the body of Christendom. They had a new and powerful guidebook for their work. In 1487, two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This book became one of the most infamous texts in European history. It was a comprehensive manual on witchcraft. It argued passionately that witchcraft was real, that it was the worst of all crimes, and that failing to prosecute it was itself a sin. The book was divided into 3 parts. The first proved the existence of witches using scripture and theology. The second described the various forms of witchcraft, from making a pact with the devil to causing impotence or summoning hailstorms. The third part gave detailed instructions on how to legally prosecute a witch. The Malleus Maleficarum laid out a full legal procedure. It explained how to bring an accusation, how to interrogate witnesses, and how to handle a defiant or silent suspect. It gave official sanction to the use of torture. Since the pact with the devil was a secret crime with no outside witnesses, a confession was seen as the ultimate proof. Torture was considered a necessary tool to get this confession. The book argued that a demon might give a witch the power to resist pain, so the torture had to be especially severe. It also displayed a deep and obsessive misogyny, arguing that women were more carnal, more credulous, and therefore far more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men. The book was a bestseller, reprinted many times, and it helped spread these dangerous ideas across Europe. The witch trial itself was a terrifying ordeal. It often began with a local accusation. Someone's crops failed or their child died, and they blamed a neighbor, often an old, poor, unpopular woman. Once the authorities got involved, the process took on a life of its own. The accused would be arrested and searched for a devil's mark, a spot on the body that was supposedly insensitive to pain where the devil had branded his servant. The interrogation would begin. If the accused did not confess, torture was applied. Under unimaginable pain, many confessed to anything their accusers wanted to hear. They would admit to flying to the Sabbath, kissing the devil, and cursing their neighbors. They would also be forced to name other witches. This led to a chain reaction of accusations that could destroy an entire community. Once a confession was secured, the sentence was almost always death. The secular authorities, not the church, carried out the execution. The most common method was burning at the stake. This had a dual purpose. It was a painful and public warning to others, and it was believed that the fire would purify the evil, destroying the witch's body so it could not be used for any further dark purposes. The hunting of the devil became a self-perpetuating machine. The more witches were found, the more it proved the existence of the conspiracy, and the more urgent the hunt became. This obsession, born in the anxieties of the late Middle Ages, did not end with them. It grew, becoming the catalyst for the terrible witch panics of the 16th and 17th centuries, a dark legacy of the medieval world's attempt to understand and conquer its deepest fears.